for joining us at this very, very important event co-sponsored by Bay Atlantic University and the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C. My name is Paolo von Schirach, and I have the privilege of serving as both the president of the Global Policy Institute as well as chair of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University, our sister institution. We work very closely together. So what I wanted to say as opening today is that this topic that we are beginning to attack, so to speak, today is extremely important. The people who are already operating in this field of climate change mitigation in particular, about what can be done to introduce measures, be they physical barriers or other business reorganizations and what have you, that will mitigate the impact of rising sea levels on coastal waters, not just here in the US, but all over the world. They're busy thinking, experimenting, considering, exchanging ideas, etc. Our humble role here is this kind of a shout out to say, hey guys, this is really serious. I don't really think that most reasonable people today would deny the fact that on account of rising temperatures, and this is due to emissions, we know that story, ice in critical areas of the world is melting, and it started melting a while ago, and that inevitably will lead to rising sea levels. I think the only debate is how fast and how soon. In other words, a situation can be serious or dramatic depending on projections of the speed of this phenomenon that we are witnessing and that I don't believe anybody in their right mind are denying. So here we are. We're all in the same boat, if I can use this weird expression, because there is no boat here. We are stuck on the coast, and we have to do something about it. I believe that there will be many opportunities in the future to revisit this topic, but for today, because there's so many angles to it, but for today, we are extremely fortunate to have with us experts who will look at this issue from different angles. But without further ado, let me turn it over to my good friend and colleague Massimo, who has kindly agreed to serve as moderator for this panel, and he will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. Massimo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, the Bay University and the Global Policy Institute that allowed us just to discuss these very important topics that is happening today, this phenomenon that is happening today in the world, and not just in United States. So today we're going to concentrate our part of the climate change on the rising sea level. As Paolo said, there are going to be different events for other topics too. So I would like to introduce the three panelists that we have today. This is just in alphabetic order. So the first one is Bill Bonnet, that is currently the chair of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. That is part of the Smithsonian Institute, that is the world's largest museum and research complex. He is also a panelist of RACES, a global and regional conferences on climate change and social entrepreneurship topics. Bill is graduated at Princeton University at the School of Public International Affairs, and graduated from also the University of Pennsylvania in law school. Thank you to be here, Bill. Second one is Doug Gaffney. Doug is Mark McDonald's deputy practice leader for coastal engineering and resiliency services. He's a member of McDonald's internal sustainability and climate change committees. Doug started his career as a coastal planner for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Philadelphia, and as a coastal engineering consultant has provided a wide range of coastal environments. The shape is, understanding on the impacts of the climate change. Doug is a professional engineer in New York and in New Jersey. He has a bachelor in science in marine engineering from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, and a master in science in applied ocean science for the University of Delaware. Thank you, Doug, to be here. The last one is Clyde Atchison, that is a partner of Journey Partner. He is committed to global innovation and entrepreneurship. Currently, Clyde is developing a global fund for sustainable air, land, sea transportation and travel, including a focus on coastal communities entrepreneurship. He's also an experienced mentor and evaluator working with the European Innovator Council, and he's spent his early career as academic researcher working at the University of Cambridge, the Imperial College, and the Tokyo University. Clyde has a PhD in biochemistry and from the Queen's University in Belfast, and an MBA from the Open University. So in terms of, thank you very much, Clyde, to be participating to this event. Location, William is in Princeton, Doug is in Philadelphia, and Clyde is in the beautiful Dublin in Ireland. I'm here in the Washington, D.C. with Paolo. So I would like to start this event with a quote from Mr. Sir David Attenborough, a person that has devoted his life for the respect of the nature and the respect of the environment. And that it goes. When someone makes a statement about climate change, he or she have to be sure that the sentence is backed up by scientific evidence. Otherwise, the person loses credibility and is very detrimental for the cause. First question that I have is for Doug. For sure, there are scientific evidence that the climate change and specifically the effect that it has on the sea level rising. What is your positions regarding those scientific evidence, Doug?
The scientific evidence for sea level rise is maybe one of the easier ones because there's several decades, if not over 100 years of sea level data that we can plot, and you can see the rising trend. So in preparation for a question like this, I did put together a couple of slides, and maybe if Denise can put up slides, I think it's slide 3. What that shows is that sea level rise is occurring. It's measurable. You can get that by simply looking at the trend over the last 100 years. And then the other thing that I would like to point out is that the sea level rise over the past several decades has been relatively consistent, but there is belief and the data is starting to show that the rate of rise is actually starting to increase in some areas. Yeah, there's the slide. So for those of you looking, there's a couple of interesting points here. One is that sea level rise is not consistent in every location in the world, and that's because there are factors like land subsidence in some areas. There's the fact that the globe is rebounding from the last ice age. So in some places you might actually have sea level decrease, but in most places there is measurable sea level rise. In the United States, the East Coast, where I'm most familiar, there's, it's about 3 to 4 millimeters per year. And that rate is expected to continue to increase. And what you see on the left is an example of the type of sea level rise curves that we as engineers use when designing a project. And typically there's a low, medium, and high, and it's based on projections of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and what we think is going to happen in terms of the governments of the world, and whether we're able to kind of get a handle on the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we're putting into the environment. So one of the challenges as an engineer is to take this data and understand how it may impact what you're designing on the coast.
Sounds good. I mean, actually, well, this is the data that the engineers use when they have to take in consideration the rise of the level of the ocean. The next question, and I would like to involve Doug. No, vorrei involvere Bill. I'm sorry. Bill is the chair of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. So this center is involved in multiple real projects, and from the analysis of the results, I believe that your organization came out with white papers, reports, to be distributed to the regulator and to the politicians. My question is, can you present us in 5 minutes possible, because I know that it's a big topics, the philosophy of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and how the research center manager, interpreting the results obtained, make available these results to the public?
Thanks, Massimo. CERC, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, above all, we provide science-based knowledge. It's perhaps most akin to a university research department, even though we're a part of a museum complex. We have 26 PhD level scientists doing, I guess it's over 45 at the moment, peer-reviewed science-based projects on coastal ecosystems. So we're very widely published in academic journals, and that would be one of the primary means, the way any researcher, of course, gets his or her information out to the public. But given the gravity of this situation and the Smithsonian's realization, along with other major institutions worldwide, obviously we have as robust a possible public education outreach on these subjects that we possibly can. So the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center.org has a very capacious website, which will have all the things, every one of the things I'm about to talk about. Trying to pick out the specific research projects that might be most apt today is very difficult, but let me just highlight a few. And when you go to the website and when you pull up these specific items, you'll get a better understanding than a couple minute summary will do. We are a part of Global Earth Observatory Network, so-called GEO networks for forest ecosystems, but for our purposes, coastal marine ecosystems, that's called Marine Geo. So we're one of dozens of academic research and governmental organizations which have stations posted around the world in coastal areas, which do an enormous number of measurements on a real-time basis, and that longitudinal data is kept and aggregated over time. So we have a very good idea of what's going on, increasingly good idea of what's going on in coastal ecosystems. So the marine geosystem is very valuable. as a tool for scientists to understand coastal ecology trends. Another very, I think, significant part of what we do comes under the heading of so-called blue carbon. Blue carbon is simply carbon that's embedded in a coastal ecosystem. So that is tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. It's perhaps not as widely known a term as some of the other terms we're all learning about in this field, but it's becoming a burgeoning research topic because, in fact, coastal ecosystems are, I think the best way to describe it, they're hotspots of carbon sequestration. So when we look to how we can mitigate or understand sea level rise, the actual carbon embedded in those coastal ecosystems, if we can preserve and enhance it, will help us not only understand sea level rise, but will help us mitigate sea level rise. So that's a very, very valuable part of what we do, and we are part indeed, and I should emphasize, and I think Clyde and Doug are probably familiar with a lot of this work as much or more than I am. There's a Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network, which is, again, very widely subscribed to and now is engaged in the organizational task of aggregating all this research on coastal carbon and disseminating it. So the coastal ecosystem accounts for nearly 50% of the organic carbon buried in the ocean, despite occupying less than 1% of ocean area. So there's another area that perhaps the public isn't as aware of, and that's the beneficial effect of these coastal ecosystems. So I can stop there. I could go on for hours, of course, but let me stop there as a good summary.
No, thank you very much. I mean, actually, you how you reach the public? Yeah, you reach it with your website that they are very, very comprehensive, and basically you mentioned 4 or 5 or 6 of them. They are incredible. I mean, valuable. Thank you very much. I mean, Bill. Now a question for Clyde. I mean, Clyde, you see, I mean, the first 2 questions that were one, I mean, very technical, and the second one was, I mean, the point of view of a research, I mean, a center. Clyde is a little bit different. So he's approaching, I mean, the problem with, I mean, an entrepreneurial, I mean, ship, I mean, approach. So, of course, he technically involved, I mean, in the coastal resilience problem, but his attention goes more into business opportunities that have to involve indigenous, I mean, community for during the preparation, the duration, the reconstruction, and the readaptation of the same community after the intense event. So my question to you, Clyde, is what is your position when a problem becomes an opportunity for the local community?
Thank you very much, Massimo. Yes, you're correct. I come at this at a very people-centric approach. I look at this as the challenge between climate change needs to be innovative and needs to be innovative by technology. I think too often we're seeing that the response to climate change, especially by sectors which I'm involved in, which are the transportation, aviation, and maritime industries, has been really to kick the can down the road as such by saying, well, we'll pay for carbon offsets rather than looking at developing new technology and innovation to solve what is society's biggest challenge, which is the effects of climate change. And when I say people-centric, we're really, as a firm, really interested in coastal communities and how coastal communities can be actively involved in being a voice for the change, but also being involved in developing the solutions and being a part of not only generating the solutions, but benefiting from the solutions. Because one of the big challenges, especially with coastal communities, is that they really are dependent on tourism as a way of bringing in their economic value. And if you look across all tourism, 80% of tourism is in coastal areas. So therefore, living and looking at where we are at a post-COVID world where there's been very little tourism for the last year, these communities which are already suffering are going to be in a worse area. And it's time to look at how we can now start to look at helping these communities be involved in the fight against climate change, but also making that fight long-term by creating industries around sustainability. And I think for us, there's so very little people looking at this area and how to fund these type of enterprises, but also how to encourage people in these areas to be entrepreneurs and be developing solutions for climate change which are long-reaching, and helping them really diversify away from tourism, because tourism by its nature is seasonal, and it's not tends to be high level or high skilled positions. So what we're looking for, what we're looking at, is bringing this long-term economy which is based on sustainability and having that real impact in the investment which we're bringing, but also then encouraging those communities to keep people in the communities. And I think often the challenge is for young people, there's not opportunities, so they tend to leave the communities, go to wider or bigger cities or other areas, and then the communities are bereft of talent and skills which are needed for developing industries which are not the lower skilled industries, such as the service industries associated with tourism. So for us, that's a really important area. How can we develop these enterprises which are solving and having an impact against climate change, and also is having that long-term impact within the communities which they're based in?
Thank you, Clyde. That is a very, very interesting angle that you approach. When we are dealing with this catastrophic events that related also to the sea level rising. But I will stay with you, if it's possible, Clyde, because you mentioned a couple of things, a very, very interesting one. The tourism, a new tourism that you would like to see, in those communities. How do you envision this new tourism? It's true, you said that the tourism is a seasonal, but at the same time, we are looking for a long-term economy. How this tourism should probably change over time?
Yep. And I think tourism is changing, and I think you're starting to see with the generation that's coming through, when they are traveling now, they want to experience authentic experiences and want to have those experiences to be sustainable. And there's more and more evidence coming through that this is what people are expecting when they're traveling. Also, what you're starting to see now is the rise of the digital nomad experience, where even before COVID, it was becoming more and more of a way where people can work remotely. I think one of the responses to COVID is that people are now realizing that they can work more remotely, and they're looking at coastal communities. And this has already been seen in several of the coastal communities in Europe, which they are already launching digital nomad or remote working practices and trying to attract people there who are staying a longer term within these traditional seaside or coastal resorts, so that they're having a wider and improved impact, because not only are they providing more income, they're actually bringing skills to this region, which then can be used for other enterprises, but also help and mentor other potential companies. So the rise of remote workers and digital nomadism is a really big benefit for coastal communities, and especially if you look at island communities where they've had depopulation for a number of years. This is an opportunity for them to attract skilled workforce who can then be able to develop enterprises within small island communities.
Thank you, Clyde. Next question would be to Doug. Doug, we have Bill already introduced some of the measures that use, I mean, in the sea level rising, I mean, fight every day that we have, mangroves and marshes and areas. I know that you are dealing with these coastal infrastructures every day, and there are infrastructures that they're protective infrastructure, they are responsive infrastructure, and they are, I mean, the daily use infrastructure, like the roads, the bridges, boardwalk even. So, but any time that we discuss about the infrastructures, I mean, coastal infrastructure, and we put together, I mean, the infrastructure with the climate change. We use, I mean, two words, I mean, to express that. One is adaptation. Another one is protection. There is a difference between adaptation and protection.
Well, it's a subtle difference. Protection is using infrastructure. So let's start with infrastructure. Infrastructure can be a wide range of interventions, if you will, right? So on the coast, you can have a beach and a dune is a very good protective structure that is natural in the sense that once you place it, it erodes and it moves around and it adjusts to storm events, for example. Marshes and mangroves are very good buffers for storm impacts. You know, we've seen that over the years. If you think about the tsunami in, what year was that? 2004, I believe it was. The areas that had their intact, very wide mangroves did a lot better than those areas that had removed those. So, you know, there's a protective aspect to a feature that also is a very good carbon sink, as Bill alluded to. So then, you know, the range of infrastructure tools, if you will, that provide protection, you know, go from beaches, dunes, living shorelines, designing with the ability to naturally respond to storms, all the way up to hard structures. And in some cases, you know, you do need to protect your coastal community because, as Clyde mentioned, there is so much of the economy, especially in coastal areas, that are related to that coastal environment. So if you just say, okay, well, let's have everyone, you know, move away from the area that is susceptible to storms and sea level rise, you can't just do that because there's so much invested in those areas that there is a level of protection that's required. So then adaptation is the ability to design your protective structure so that in the future, as sea level does rise and as the impacts at your shoreline get higher in terms of elevation, you know, at a certain point, it's like a trigger point. You can say that, okay, let's design this wall to be at +10, but we know that sea level is rising at a certain rate or maybe even increase in the future. So at a certain point, we should then enact an adaptive measure. And we've seen examples of that in parts of the world. In South America, for example, in Guyana, there's a seawall protecting the largest city in the country. And the city, much of the city is actually below sea level, so a little bit like Holland. And the seawall in very recent years has started to become overtopped due to storms and high tides as a direct result of sea level rise. So they have been able in some places to put on this additional height as an adaptive measure. Now, of course, you know, when the storm is not occurring, people don't like so much height to protect their community, because one of the reasons they're there is so that they can, see the ocean from the aesthetics perspective, but also fishermen and people who utilize the coast for their livelihood need to have access to that coast. So the design of adaptive measures allows for a gradual response to sea level rise.
Okay, okay. Well, it's very, very, very clear. I mean, now, because the difference between the two, adaptation and protection, is always a debatable one. You can say probably adaptation is some kind of a protection in progress, something like that. Something similar to that. Question for Doug. Doug, because again, you are the chair of this research center. I go back on these reports, and all this, results that you obtain that probably you're giving to the politician and to the influencers. These reports are accepted by these political bodies? And are you some kind responsible for the implementation of these guidelines?
You must have met me. Well, that's of course the $64 trillion question. As I think all of you know, and the audience should know, we don't have a world governing body that effectively regulates national economies. We have the IPCC, which will be meeting again, we hope, in 2021 as a follow-on to the Paris Accords. It's pretty hard to overstate the importance of that gathering, because that will set goals, national goals, which need to be strengthened and upgraded by the year 2030 to avoid the worst outcomes on global warming. So it's impossible to answer your question in a narrow sense. Our research, and literally hundreds of thousands of pieces of research, go into the mosaic. I was on a call with Michael Oppenheimer, who's one of the world's leading climatologists, who's been responsible for the IPCC reports for the last 25 years. So we have a great body of knowledge that's been built up in the scientific community. I think it is it's pretty fair to say is frustrated by the difficulty of translating that scientific message into public policy. We could easily spend the rest of the year, if you want to have go to the mattresses, and we'll wind this up on New Year's Eve. So that's the question that we all face. It's a political question on a national basis. It's a political question on a regional basis. It's a political question on an international basis. And we do our part to inform the public, including public officials, of our findings. But we are not, as most researchers are not, we are not political advocates. And it's important to recognize the division which you stated, and that is the science has to be objective, and then that objective knowledge has to be put in the hands of policymakers. So that's proven to be a rather difficult task that we're all grappling with. How's that for a non-answer?
No, that is actually an answer. No, actually, we like just for the benefit of all the participants, the IPCC is an intergovernmental panel of climate change. So this, because you mentioned 2 or 3 times, so probably somebody that is not very familiar with that.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for your, try to answer the questions. Now back to Clyde. Clyde, you were mentioned before grants that can be distributed, to people that they want to start a new business after, in this community, coastal community. Besides, I don't know the numbers specifically for Ireland, but I believe that more than 70% of the people in Ireland lives on the coastal, areas.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very important, questions to be asked how we keep these people working. So how do you envision this grant could be distributed to these entrepreneurial people? How do you envision that?
I just actually want to sort of follow up on something Bill said, right? Like, I feel now that the decision needs to be really taken out of politicians' hands and actually needs to be built from the ground up, because there's been consistent lack of policy action on a global area. So therefore, we really need to start to help the communities build solutions for themselves. I'm working with technologists and innovators and universities and researchers to solve the challenges such as what Doug said about Guyana. These solutions need to be built, but they need to be built from the ground up, because the communities need to be behind the solutions and the innovations coming through. And we live in a world where there's constant, I'm going to say, disbelief of what politicians can do, but I think the trust in politicians is probably a better term. The trust in politicians to actually achieve lasting impact in climate is probably non-existent amongst communities. So I feel now really what we really need to do is how can we build up these solutions from the ground up. And you said grants. I do think that the challenge is how do we make this sustainable in a business sense. I think one of the big challenges within innovation around climate change is a lot of the solutions are just simply don't have a business model behind them. They may be well-meaning, but in terms of making them financially sustainable, they're not going to be able there. I feel that if you look across the world, if this really being able to build an infrastructure around supporting people who have good ideas around solving problems around climate change and being able to give them the right mentorship and also the peer network, and this could be a peer network of small island or coastal communities around the world, so they're solving the problems, is really correct. And I think more and more you're seeing in Europe that funding being available for innovators. As you said at the start of my introduction, I'm involved with the European Innovation Council, who recently provided 330 million euros for funding for innovators. And one of the biggest campaign of that is that Europe would invest in high risk and what they state unbackable solutions, which really could champion solutions for climate change within Europe. And really, with that, they had to produce a long-term, how they're producing impact, but also how can they be in a business model. So I'm not a big believer that grants should be given out for grants' sake. I think grants should be really, really carefully monitored in terms of what impact they are, but also they should be produced for projects which have that opportunity to develop a long-term sustainable financial model behind them.
Thank you. Thank you. Clyde, a question for Doug. All the discussion we had on the coastal infrastructures, I mean, what we have to build to fight, I mean, this sea level rising. At the end, just we would like to obtain, I mean, a situation that is more resilient. And the resilience, there are tons, I mean, of different, I mean, terms, I mean, to express what the resilience is. In my opinion, the resilience, the coastal resilience, if I may, is the ability of the community to bounce back after, I mean, big hurricanes or a coastal storm and flooding, rather than simply reacting to the impact. So, said that, I mean, and if that definition, I mean, it makes sense, how you quantify the resilience?
So that's a very good question and a good topic of research that's going on right now. I would like to maybe preface the response to your question about quantification by building off of what Clyde said. You know, we have an example on the southern coast of New Jersey of a community that a long time ago began the process of building resiliency into some of their infrastructure. So raising roads, raising, for example, the electrical boxes that run the pumps that allow storm water to be pumped out through the storm drains. And so when Hurricane Sandy hit, this particular community was in pretty good shape. You know, they suffered some damage, but their ability to bounce back and get their economy running again was greatly enhanced by the money that they had spent in previous years. So they had a lot of foresight and forethought, because one of the problems is when you go into a community and you say, you know, sea level is rising, you see sunny day and blue sky flooding more and more frequently, and the thoughts go to, oh my goodness, this is going to cost a lot of money. And if you stay on that, you're going to be discouraged, and you're going to kind of throw your hands up and say, oh my goodness, what can we do? And so my recommendation is to start the planning process. Look at those areas in your community that are kind of weak points, and start to look at what options there are to develop responses to increase resiliency in your community. And then that kind of gets back to this issue of money. It does cost money. And so those coastal communities that have a good tax base, are more likely to be able to afford increase in taxes, et cetera. Whereas there's a little bit of a social justice issue behind all this for those communities that don't have those sorts of resources. And if you recall, a couple years ago, there was a Black Friday report that was provided by the federal government that described what the impacts of climate change were going to be. And one of the impacts that was described was impacts that are going to be greater on those communities that don't have the same level of economic ability to address it. So, unfortunately, there is a requirement for politicians and leaders to get involved and help distribute funding in such a way that we can increase resiliency. Okay. So now to get back to your question, Massimo, about quantifying that, there's a really good paper that I've been using kind of as a background for developing this concept of resiliency. And it was work done, let me see if I can find it just to make sure I provide the proper reference. Michael Bruno and Andre Reinhorn. And they were looking at it from earthquake resiliency and how the expenditure of money to add resiliency could be quantified in the amount of protection and the recovery after this event. So actually, if Denise could show just one image, it's this one. I want to describe what that concept looks like and the kind of direction we're thinking about going with quantifying resilience. So this is an example of a, yeah, go to that one. That's great. Yep. Thank you. So on the bottom axis, it's time, and on the vertical axis, it's system performance. And you can see that if you build in this case, it's a concrete seawall, you have a certain amount of resilience built in to that storm. When the storm happens and the seawall is destroyed, you can see that your resilience drops between T0, which is the event, so a big storm, and T star, which is the point at which you can repair that. Now, if you repair that structure to the same degree that it was before, you know, you're going to not have any additional resilience for the next storm, which may or may not be more severe due to sea level rise and other climate change factors. So the idea of building that resilience in during the repair will then allow your system performance or your quantification to be improved. So that's a whole kind of theory behind that, and takes into account fragility of the structures and the infrastructure and the economy behind the wall. And this same thing could be applied to beaches. It could be applied to any number of infrastructure that is there for protection and for increasing resiliency. So I just wanted to show you that concept.
Well, thank you. I mean, that is very, very clear, and just see, I mean, how you can project and then put in graphs, I mean, this quantitative resilience, how do you qualify the resilience? That is a very, very interesting one. And thank you very much. But question to, a quick question to Bill. In terms of the, especially, I mean, in this, you know, among all the projects that you are studying at this point, how many are those, I mean, referring to the resilience effort by the coastal city?
Well, indirectly, a lot of them, but I think in my limited time, let's just focus on a couple of things that pick up previous thoughts. Mm-hmm. There's a, not a Smithsonian entity, but it's an entity called Climate Central, which you can look up on the web, and they have a report, Flooded Future, Global Vulnerability to Sea Level Rise Worse Than Previously Understood. So picking up on Doug's point, we have in the foreseeable future, within 30 years, we're going to have upwards of 300 million people in coastal communities around the world below the median high tide line. So it's a real world problem in a country like Bangladesh, in Dhaka, in China, in Bangkok, Thailand. So there is not going to be a substitute for effective governmental action, for sure, in areas that are both poor or developing, and the real world impacts on vulnerable coastal communities. On the other side of the coin, Miami Beach is an example of a build-up area where the infrastructure is already there, and Doug would be an expert on this, but Miami Beach is putting upwards of $500 million into projects over the next several years, which will raise the roadbed in parts of Miami Beach in order to protect against rising sea levels, installing pumps, water mains, redoing sewer connections. So there's not going to be a substitute for major governmental expenditures one way or another to protect against sea level rise. So I am in utter and complete agreement with Clyde that our true salvation is going to be innovative entrepreneurial solutions, but that has to be supplemented with effective governmental action.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, Bill. Clyde, I mean, just a clarification that could help, I mean, the participant to this event. You said that the European Innovator Council, it just funded 330 million euro for this innovation. How the number one is the European Innovator Council, so is it going to be only for the European countries, or is it going to be extended to the North America or South America?
Unfortunately, it's only European countries.
Okay.
And I agree with Doug. The challenge is how do we get the sufficient policy funding from governments to support entrepreneurial activities, but you need to have the infrastructure in place to help these communities. And I think even in the US, there's really interesting projects which are going on, such as the RISE Resilience Program in Norfolk in Virginia, where they've developed a $2 million grant form for innovative solutions coming from the community to look at how they can tackle the rising sea challenge in coastal communities. And I think those kind of challenges and innovation challenges are good for not only providing solutions, but also showing the art of the possible to policymakers and how this can be done. And as also with Doug, I used to work in government, so I used to see people coming in and saying this will cost $10 billion. And I'm going, oh, please don't say that number, because the fear of the big number is always the dread of a policymaker. So I think for us, there's always going to be a need for policy, and especially around regulation. And I think there's always going to be a need for that. But I do think that there needs to be both a bottom-up and a top-down approach. And the top-down approach is not working at the moment.
Okay.
True.
I have just one question just arrived, and probably is the continuation of what Clyde was saying. What innovation and projects currently under development are you most excited for? Who wants to ask this question?
Any number. We're working in San Francisco Bay on restoring a very degraded ecosystem, which is also extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, by planting of oyster beds. So that's a good example of what Clyde's talking about, which is a relatively affordable kind of intervention that can make a real difference in an already developed area. So for sure, we need a combination. We need all of the above. And that's a good example of an innovative tackling of a problem.
Absolutely. Innovation is the name of the future in each single area.
About those Oyster Reef projects is that the idea is that once you get that oyster reef in place, it's a living structure, and the oysters hopefully will be able to take over and respond to sea level rise by building their community up and continuing to provide protection for the upland. And yeah, we're working on quite a few of those, and it is very exciting work.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Great. Doug, during your previous question, you mentioned, and I put it down here on my piece of paper, the sunny days and the blue sky. How they are related with this tragic situation that we see every day, along the coast?
The terms blue sky and sunny day flooding relate to the kind of flooding that you get on your streets that are not related to a storm. And back in the day, maybe you would get one full moon, high tide event, and you'd get a little bit of flooding on your street, and it was a nuisance. It's also called nuisance flooding. We have places like the Naval Academy in Annapolis that have been tracking this type of flooding event, and the increase in the number of those flood events per year is definitely increasing. And so what we're seeing is that now something that's kind of a nuisance flooding is starting to impact, the ability of people to drive on these streets, and the value of homes, for example, in a coastal residential community. If you know that every full moon you have to go park your car somewhere else, it's an annoyance. Maybe that is a first world problem, but it's a harbinger of things to come. And I had one example, which was Fort Eustis in Virginia, and in 1930, that's when they started recording these types of events. And, you know, at a 0.4 millimeter per year sea level rise, that ends up being, my notes here about that particular example. The bottom line is that at these facilities, especially naval and Coast Guard facilities, you know, they know and they see that sea level rise is occurring. They see that the number of these sunny day flooding events are increasing, and that is forcing a response to increase resiliency and provide additional protection.
Okay, well, it's actually, I mean, it's a visible effect or phenomenon that justify the rising of the sea level.
Yeah.
I mean, because it doesn't is attached, I mean, to any type of storms.
Okay.
Okay, so I have another question coming from the participant, and this is to Doug. Do you think the United States Marine Corps engineers' prediction of a sea level rise, low, medium, and high, are known by most designers, and have they been consistently implemented into coastal design, either for infrastructure or coastal restoration?
So the answer is yes. I think most designers do know about the sea level rise scenarios. And the Corps of Engineers, in their projects, they are trying to develop a consistent approach to that. It's a thorny issue, as you can imagine. Thorny in that if you take the worst case scenario, then you're designing something that is so big, so massive, and so costly that it's no longer affordable based on the policy and guidelines that the Corps of Engineers works under. So they're making strides in how to implement the sea level rise curves. Now, is that implemented in the private sector engineering community consistently? No, definitely not. And there's a, you know, we allow and encourage really communities to kind of weigh in on this topic. You know, do you want to design for a risk scenario? Like, how much risk are you as a community willing to take? How much risk are you personally willing to take? These are questions that get answered on a local, sometimes state level.
It's not true, I mean, Doug, that the curves, the same curves prepared by the IPCC are a little bit worse than the Corps engineers, I mean, curves.
There are some scenarios, and they're based on like I said, the amount of carbon that's predicted and what that impact may be. So there are different scenarios. And I think one of the worst, you know, highest level scenarios that people don't really like to talk about is in this catastrophic occurrence where large portions of the Antarctic ice shelf collapse and melt, because that really changes the game.
Okay. I don't see any other, thank you very much, Doug. I mean, I don't see any other questions, I mean, from the participants. I mean, we got another minute to go. There is Clyde, did you have any suggestion that you want to give it to the participants? I mean, how to become entrepreneurs?
I think, like, I'm really optimistic. I think there's a lot of solutions out there. I agree. There's a whole level of circular economy which can happen with the ocean. Even with rising sea levels, there could be solutions and materials which are coming from the ocean which can provide solutions. I think most of the training and skills which are required for entrepreneurs are still need to be developed in a lot of communities. So for me, I'm really positive. I think we do have an opportunity, if we act now, to really develop new innovation and new technologies to solve these challenges.
Thank you. I mean, Clyde. Bill, last word for you. I mean, how do you, any suggestion that you have for the participants, how to be more involved, I mean, in this coastal resiliency?
Listen, Doug stated there is a danger that this could get significantly worse. So to anybody in the younger generation, follow the science, follow it closely, and become more involved in the way that you know how to become involved best, to advocate, to experiment. If you have an entrepreneurial bent, use that. I agree with Clyde. We have enormous potential to ameliorate these problems, but this could be the most significant short to medium term effect of global warming. I'm not diminishing the fire possibility, but we have a significant issue that's on our doorstep on sea level rise, so it must be watched carefully.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. And so at this point, we are at 12 o'clock, so we are on time too. That is another good target that we reached. Thank you for participating to this event and spend time, your precious time with us, and sharing with us your experiences, your excellences. As Paolo said before, this is probably the first events on climate change and coastal city resilience. There are going to be probably another 2 or 3 of them, and one I can envision right away would be how much the federal budget is allocated for shore protection or adaptation projects. So how much money we have available just to do what we have discussed today. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a continuous nice day.
Thank you, Massimo.
Thank you, Massimo.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.